Haere mai ki te hui nei, and welcome to today's webinar, everyone. I am Christina Howard, and the topic we're going to discuss today, how we can fund effectively for change, is one that is really close to my heart. So I've worked in the funding sector for nearly 15 years now, first in government, then for a family philanthropy, and most recently as a consultant to the funding sector, both in a private capacity and with Paradigm, Inspiring Communities consulting arm. So I was really thrilled when they asked me to host today's webinar. And what I've observed over my time in the funding sector is that well-constructed, high-trust, relationship-focused funding can really supercharge the outcomes that we get from our funding dollar. And we've seen over COVID, the response to the first lockdown, and then again more recently in the response to the floods in Auckland and in Cyclone Gabrielle, how some of those elements of funding really come to the fore and been really effective. But unfortunately, it's been difficult. It seems to have been difficult to sustain those in between those crisis events. And what we have seen, though, is that some funders really are starting to explore those more relationship-focused, less transactional funding relationships. And we have some of these people with us today to share what they've been doing, how they've been doing it, and give you all some examples from real life, I guess, of what this can look like and the tools that will be helpful to moving into those spaces. So I want to start today by acknowledging that we have had in the past these quite competitive, transactional, accountability-focused funding systems in place because they were seen as being the best way to achieve the outcomes that we wanted to get, to ensure that our funding dollars were well spent. And unfortunately, I don't think we've seen much evidence that those systems have produced those results that we were hoping for, in terms of really making sure that we were supporting the kinds of things that we want to say and see. And in fact, I think our communities have told us that those processes have actively reduced their ability to do things or undermined the potential for community-led change by creating competitiveness and patch protection, and just soaking up a massive amount of time and resources and creativity and energy that people could be spending on the community-led change, on making things better in their communities. And I've also observed that rather than being based on real constraints, these competitive transactional funding practices are often just because we just keep doing them because we've always done them that way, or because there's some perceived risk around it, because maybe we're not thinking really rigorously about what is going to be the best funding practice to support the outcomes that we want to see, like equity, like collaboration, like local leadership. So in this webinar, we're going to have a look at some of those practical changes, as I said before, in funding approaches that can create better funding effectiveness with examples from our panelists. And together they're going to offer some insights on how to unlock the potential of funding to create community change. So before we get underway, let's meet our panelists. And with us today, we have a wonderful range of people. We have Anna Parker, and Anna wears many hats. She is works in her own right as a consultant with Matawai Associates. She's also part of the Inspiring Communities team. And as a member of Dunedin Community Builders, she recently co-authored an amazing resource called Be the Change Funding and Equity, which I think personally all funders should read. We also welcome Seamus Fentham, who is the current chair of Philanthropy New Zealand and the executive director at the Todd Foundation, a family philanthropy, which has been trialling and moving towards different ways of funding for many years, different ways of more relational funding for many years. And we're also really lucky to have with us Blair Carpenter from the Department of Internal Affairs, who is the coordinator of the Nelson Tasman CoLab that brings funders and communities together in conversation about local projects and initiatives. So it's wonderful to have you all with us. Welcome. And for you in the audience today, as our speakers are talking, please don't forget to post your questions in the Q&A. We will get to them later after all of our panelists have finished with their presentations. We have some technical support here in the background, so if you're having any Zoom issues, you can message Tess in the chat and she will help you out with those. We are recording the webinar, so the recording will be sent out after we've finished with links to many of the resources that we are going to be talking about today. So if you're wondering if you can get those resources, yes, we will be sending them out to you afterwards. All right, let's get started with you, Anna. And Be the Change, I think, really outlines what a sound equity-driven funding system could look like. And it was something that Dunedin community builders felt was really necessary to put out in the world. So I'd love to hear a wee bit more about how this report came into the world and the key things that are standing out for you now, a year on from publishing that.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koe Christina. Ngā mihi hoki ki koutou ko tai mai nei I tēnei wā. Ko Anna Parker tuku ingoa, no Otipoti ahau. Kei konei au ki te tautoko, te kaupapa o te rānei. Pēnā rā tātou katoa. Thank you so much, Christina, for the introduction and the warm welcome into this kōrero this morning. I just want to acknowledge you and all that you bring in terms of your knowledge of the funding system, but also to our other speakers today, to Blair and to Seamus, and all that they are doing in their mahi to elevate community aspirations and to work for a just and equitable funding system. So how did we get here? How did a little grassroots volunteer-led underfunded network of people in Otipoti decide to, write this resource and to sort of speak to the transformational change that we really need to see in our funding system? Well, we got here because during our first national lockdown, our network, Otipoti Dunedin Community Builders, we were meeting online and lots of hui just to provide connection and support to our community organisations and grassroots groups across our city. And what we kept hearing in our kōrero with each other during that lockdown was the struggles our communities were facing with trying to access the resources they needed to do the mahi that it was so urgent in terms of the service of their communities. And what we heard was distressing, the amount of time that was going in to just navigating funding systems that just weren't giving the resources, weren't putting the resources in the right place. So although I'm a contributor to this resource, like Be the Change, Funding and Equity, it's been a long journey to get to this resource, because what we first of all did is we heard what our communities were saying, and so we pulled it together late at night after our paid mahi during the day, and late at night we've pulled together a first report that was called Funding for Change in Otipoti. And Funding for Change in Otipoti really just evolved from there into a series of hui. And so we sometimes manage to pull these hui and conversations together just before. One of them was even just the day of another national lockdown. but we kept the conversation going, and we kept people talking with each other about what would change actually look like in across the funding system that would actually allow and enable communities to be doing the important work that they've been wanting to do and needing to do. So so through the many hui, and I think I've got so many photos of hui of us meeting and kōrero and conversation, but through these hui and these conversations, we eventually knew that we needed to produce something that went a bit deeper and that really spoke to, was, provided a how-to guide really of how we could bring about the change that we need to see. And I think that it's quite useful if I just sort of talk to how, like, our methodology or our pathway for change, we would like to think in Ōtepoti community builders that we want to walk our talk. So our way of bringing these conversations together is very much also like the sort of change that we're asking for or hoping to see. So we always seek to whakamana and to amplify and centre community voice. We believe that be the change is that harnessing of community voice. We seek to create the spaces that allow communities to speak for themselves, and we always look to create the space for the voices that might hold the least power in these conversations. And that what we've also found is that in no single small community group is able to really have the time or to speak to all the change that they need to see in the system. So bringing people together for that collective voice has been a significant part of our work. We also really believe in these conversations to be held by manaakitanga. We really invite everybody to the same table, like we literally bring people to the same table. We feed everyone generously in these conversations. And when I say everyone to the same table, I mean our CEOs, our chair people of funding committees, our councillors, our MPs, our activators and grassroots community workers, leaders of our Māori and Pacific organisations. So we bring everyone to the same table. We disrupt any of those traditional notions of power and who can speak to who, and we bring people into kōrero and conversation with each other with kai. And we've also found that what we can need to continue to have is courage to sit with and in the uncomfortable conversations, because we are talking about disrupting traditional power relationships, traditional notions of charity and giving. And so we are talking about having to sit with some of these conversations that can be uncomfortable when we examine our own power and our own privileges. And then I think what we have ultimately heard from our community is just how great relationships within the funding system can be absolutely transformational. We have a chapter or a section in Be the Change called Scones, Not Wine. And this is a quote that came from one of our hui, where one of our community elders spoke to this idea that about moving away from the sort of corporate style schmoozing with a glass of wine, and that manaakitanga is about taking the scones and the cup of tea to the hui and making time for a kōrero. Community building starts with relationship building, a real genuine interest in people in their lives. And so our community really spoke to what real, genuine, meaningful relationships look and feel like within the funding system, and how this can be quite a transformative force for change when we move away from the transactional and into the relational. and that our community was really clear about what that can look like. And so the scones not wine section in Be the Change really does speak to what a great enabler within the funding system can look like. And it's someone who really takes the time to know their communities, where they're conscious of their own power, but deeply respect community aspirations. They understand the theory and the practice of community-led development, and they'll pull down barriers wherever they can, within their power to pull down barriers. And they ultimately, they feed people, you know, they bring the scones. So it's about offering that manaaki. And we have had some beautiful examples here in Ōtepoti of neighbours within the funding system who really understand and have modelled that way of being in relationship with community. And I think I've got a last image here just to share like that from across our funding system in Ōtepoti. We continue here to hold and host. These are community driven hui, but to hold and host these conversations about how at all levels through the system we can be the change. I'll leave it there, Christina.
Yeah. Ngā mihi kia koe, Anna. That is amazing mahi that you have done, and really, and the team at Ōtepoti Community Builders and the whole Ōtepoti community, I think, particularly continuing those conversations is fantastic. And lots to pick up on there throughout our time together this morning. So I'm sure people will have questions for you about that later on. And I want to move on to you, Seamus, now, because I think the work that Todd Foundation has done over about the last decade in moving from transactional funding relationships to much more relational funding models has been a journey that's been built on many of those values that Anna talked about. So I'm really interested to hear about that. I know you did some reflections on that through your funding and youth employment, but it's been a theme through the Todd Foundation's mahi over the last decade or more. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about that, and maybe the three levels or aspects that you're thinking about around enabling that relational change that we've spoken about previously.
O tēnā koutou tuatai, tēnā koe Christina, te kaikaraki o tō tata nei hui. Mia te kia koe, ngā panelist, Rachel, Inspiring Communities, koutou mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Ko ai au ko Seamus Fox Phantom tōku ingoa, he uri o Ngāti Parau me whakatohia, me Ngāti Italy ki te taho tōku pāpā. No te tai rāwhiti a hau, engari anai nei e noho ana au kiko nei ki te whanganui a tara. Po te kai whakahaere o te rōpū Todd Foundation, o reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. So kia ora everyone, thank you Christina, thank you panelists, really awesome kōrero. So Seamus Phantom from the Todd Foundation, which is the philanthropic foundation of the Todd family, set up in 1972, and last year we celebrated our 50th year. I've been there for 13 years and keen to share some of the learnings and some of the changes I've seen over that time. I just want to quickly start with two quick things. One, just noting, I'm just adding a lens from a family foundation perspective, or one family foundation, not speaking on behalf of community trust. Government, I know, have different processes and systems as well, so just noting that. And the second point I wanted to chuck up just to help maybe frame was, you know, if you have a spectrum of funding and on one side it's maybe small funds, quite transactional, fast, not a huge investment in the relationship, and on the other side of the spectrum is kind of almost blind high trust funding. Probably we all fit somewhere on that spectrum. So I just want to make that note. The second point I wanted to chuck out there is we've always found it interesting to see and reflect on where your organization might currently fit on that spectrum, and why it is where it is, and where you're wanting to be on that spectrum, and what tools or what needs to shift in order to be where you want to be on that funding spectrum. And my final point in that is I just want to acknowledge that the transactional stuff is still important. I'm seeing a big move from transactional to high trust, which is awesome, but also noting I still think there's a place for transactional funding in Aotearoa New Zealand. It's not everyone can go into deep high trust relationships. So I just want to mihi to that side of the spectrum as well. Okay. So I'll start now. Christina, how's my time? All good? So in 2009, which was 1 year before I started at the foundation, Kate Frickberg, who was the then executive director, brought in a new initiative called partnership funding. So previous to that, probably the first 35 years was quite transactional funding for us, quite responsive funding. And yeah, I'd say it suited that time period, but come 2009, the partnership funding kind of really shifted the game for us in terms of relationships, because we kind of shifted from a transactional funding to more high trust, going on a longer term journey with groups and partners. By that I mean maybe changing from 1 to 2 year grants to 5 year grants, and maybe moving from $40,000 to $60,000 grants to like $100,000 a year grant. And probably the big kicker for me in terms of our learning was it was also untagged. So this program run at a high level, you're looking at 18 organizations, probably over a decade, and at its peak it was at 18 organizations on board. So it's about $400,000 per organization untagged, and bringing those groups together and learning and going into a deeper relationship, and also having opportunities to bring our trustees on that journey as well. So I think it's through that process that we also learned about the benefits and pros of actually having a deeper relationship with grantees, going beyond just a funding transaction. There's other things in addition to money we could support and connect with groups. Acknowledging that they have huge power in this relationship. It's not just us. All of those things we kind of learned and reflected on as we went along. Moving on, probably 2015, another big focus area for us was youth employment. We were able to take some of those key learnings around relationships and high trust over to the Youth Employment Initiative. So again, at a high level, it was a $3.2 million initiative. It was run in 4 regions, as well as 2 national system level initiatives. And taking that same concept of high trust with an organization, we kind of branched it out to have a high trust with a collective community-led approach. So more than just trusting a particular person or organization, it branched out to trust a more community ecosystem and some of the ideas that they had, and more untagged support. So again, that happened over a 6-year period. So there's a lot of learnings that we built on that as well. And now I guess we've moved probably 70 to 80% of our resources now to this model and way of funding with our new approach. So it's taking that same thing from partnership, youth employment, and probably now looking at all of our projects in food security and sovereignty, digital equity, advocacy for whānau. We use that same kind of model. So I just wanted to chuck that out there. It's been a rolling maul of learning, reflecting, piloting what's working, what's not working. And some of the key things that we've learned in that process is, you know, when you have a relationship with, and some of you already know, with an organization for long enough, you'll see things that pop up, challenges that pop up in organizations. It's not all roses. And that's kind of normal, I think, in the sector. I mean, people can have disagreements. You can have leadership changes, and there can be succession issues. All of those things are actually quite normal, I think, in the sector, if you've been in the sector long enough. So instead of kind of being risk averse with that, we kind of started to shift to how can we learn about it earlier through relationship, and also what can we do to help groups get through some of those challenging periods. So I think that's another key part of having a high trust relationship. I just want to move on briefly. Again, I'm just touching on these things because we have links. We're sharing links with more information. So if the Youth Employment Initiative, these case studies, feedback from community, there's our narrative of what we've learned and key learning. So prefer to kind of go to that link for more information. But one kind of frame I want to chuck on the table to think about is at the staff level, what things need to shift in the organization to enable staff to be able to enact and embed and maintain our high trust relationship. And that's an organizational conversation. For us, one thing I can say is, you know, moving from transactional to high trust is we had more time to be responsive to the relationship. Whereas when you're transactional, we're doing 300 grants, responding, you know, getting up feedback, all of those things, whereas we didn't have time to go out to community to connect, to attend their invites or their strategic meetings, whereas now we do. So I think that's kind of an example of a shift in understanding what's required, what conditions are required for your staff team to be able to enact a high trust relationship. And then the next level, kind of thinking about your decision makers. You know, you have to put this on the table. I think decision makers are a really core, important part if we're talking about transitioning to a more high trust model, because they're the ones that are accountable for the decisions that are being made. So us as staff can have really good relationships with people in high trust, but actually it's the decision makers that also are in that waka and also need to be on board with this high trust approach. So what conditions are required in your organization that will help your decision makers be okay with increasing, moving to a higher trust model? Now, I think that's a really good open conversation. And some things I think about or chuck onto the table is we have a risk. Often decision makers can see their role as being to monitor risk, but also how can they monitor opportunity as well as the risk? So one of the key things we have is a risk appetite framework. So it's not letting go of risk, it's going, yeah, we're aware of the risk, but we also want to discuss what's our appetite in terms of the opportunity and the innovative thing that's on the table as well, and put those two things together. So that the risk appetite framework, which we can share for those that are interested, is, you know, you might have zero risk for things like health and safety or legislation or finances, but for the partnership that you're having and the innovation that a group's trying to seed, your trustees might be really open to risk, to a more increased risk in that column. So it's kind of just, I guess it's opening risk up a little bit more, being a bit more holistic to, sure, you're managing risk, but also managing opportunity, not letting that miss as well. Yeah, and then the final level, so staff, what needs to happen for staff, what conditions are required for trustees, and the final kind of category I chuck on the table was, you know, the tools and resources that might be useful, you know, if groups are going on this journey. And some of the things that we've found really useful for me personally as a staff member is increased staff delegation. So you think about COVID, things were moving really fast. We were in collective funding meetings, community leaders were there going, you know who we are, you know what we do, this is what we need, are you in or are you not? Do we only have time to play this funding game? You know, one of the tools that we needed was to have increased staff delegation to be able to move on some of those things. You know, and trustees still set the boundaries of what those things are, but it really enabled us as staff to be able to move fast and respond to community. So that's a tool I think that was really useful to have available to us. I think on the other side of that is you need to increase transparency, because if you're moving fast, the trustees are still in your waka. So, you know, you need to increase transparency. So although you're moving fast and moving on some things at a certain approved level, you're still documenting the process. You're still, trustees still have access to the initiatives and what's happening. They're not totally in the dark. So increased delegation, transparency. And the final couple of key points I just want to check out, already touched on risk appetite. Shared funding agreement, I think, is another really useful tool. I would encourage any funder that's keen to pilot or trial moving more into the high trust space to consider jumping in with a shared funding agreement, leverage that risk. I'd encourage any funder, even if it was for 5K, to jump into a collective to learn and jump in with that 5K, because surely that's not a huge risk. I'm not talking about $1 million, but 5K, jump in, learn from the process and reflect that back with trustees, see how it felt before moving on. So shared funding agreement, that's also a link on some of the ones that we use. And the final thing I'd say before finishing up is there's lots of moving parts in the relationship as you go deeper. It's not just, oh, we had these KPIs and this amount of young people. It goes much deeper in these relationships, we find, and it can get quite complex and hard to write and update everyone all the time. So we kind of use a kumu, Hawaiian word, a kumu map, which we update the map with all the initiatives that we're running, so that trustees at any time can jump in there, see what we're working on, and get an update as required. So our job is to keep that map updated, not have to write 14-page update emails in every single initiative, which is quite vast with all the different projects. So those tools, I think, help aid transparency, help aid ensure that you're all in the same waka, but at the same time still allowing you to have high trust relationship with key leaders. So those are the 3 levels, and that's what we're chucking on the table. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Seamus, and thanks so much for that. I think bringing to the fore some of those processes that happen, that have to happen over time to enable high trust relationships with the community, also include enabling those high trust relationships between the decision makers and the staff who are out there doing the mahi. So I think that's a really important point that you made, and thanks for providing all of those different tools and resources, and we will be sending out links to those for people who are interested in looking at them. It's good to know that those have been trialed and tested. None of us have to start from the very beginning if we don't want to. Okay, now moving on to you, Blair. And you are working in a really different funding environment from a family foundation, so it's great to have these different perspectives. You're based in the government department, and you have a focus in a particular locality in the Nelson Tasman region, and I know that you and your funding colleagues here have thought really hard about how you can create a more effective funding system in your place and space, and within all of the different constraints that you're all working within, but you now have this really strong collaborative approach in place, and I know we'd all love to hear a bit more about that.
Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi nui kia koe, Christina, for your welcome. Thank you. And it's a privilege to be here alongside Anna and Seamus, esteemed guests, and also just a mihi to the whānau up north that are currently struggling through all of the impacts of Cyclone Gabrielle. Certainly a time to talk about how we can work collaboratively to support communities. So mihi to them as well. So yes, thanks, Christina. Kia ora whānau. Ko aora ki te moku, ko wata ki te awa, ko kaitahu te iwi, ko Blair Carpenter toka wingua. I whakapapa to kaitahu in Christchurch or Tautahi, but have grown up very much in Whakatū Nelson, and have been a community advisor with Department of Internal Affairs for coming up 5 years. And what we've seen in our regional network, funding network across the south of Tauihu, is we've seen there's a real appetite to work together. And a couple of years ago, within our funding network, we identified that communities, much like across the country, are really struggling with that burden of engagement and the administrative burden with engaging with funders. And what we're seeing is that there are a number of community groups and organisations that have, some of them in excess of 12 different funders, from central, local, philanthropic funders, and that engaging and managing all of those funds is a real struggle. So through engagement with the community, a real desire from the community for us to work together as a network, we looked at the idea of actually working as a rōpū, as a team collectively, and what we created was this concept of collab. We would create a space and a time to engage collectively with communities. And so throughout the previous 12 months, we've had a regular time throughout the year where we create opportunities for groups to come and have a kōrero with us. It's about the principles of kotahitanga, manaakitanga, whanaungatanga, and we create a space where they can come, and multiple kaimahi staff from those organisations can come and talk to us collectively and talk about their moemoeā, talk about their dreams, talk about their aspirations, and we can have a collaborative discussion. So yeah, collabs has been running, and we're also seeing another challenge for community groups is that often there's just the whole idea of navigating the funding space. Who to talk to is a real challenge, and so there's a whole lot of challenges that we're looking to sort of try and support through this idea, and also groups that have different needs. So some needs around whether it's capital items or capital works, operational expenditure. There's a whole lot of different needs that community groups have, and different funders and agencies can support different components. So that challenge of trying to navigate all of those different needs is really difficult when you're doing it in a siloed approach, in isolation. And so this idea is that we can all have that collaborative discussion and align up our resources and supports accordingly with those community groups. So the opportunity was with CoLab, we trialed it. It's now been running for, like I said, over a year. We're learning by doing. So we jumped in there and with some framework fed by with ideas from the community. So it's been community led, and there's a strong focus on te tiriti, tikanga Māori approach. We ensure we have the opening and closing with karakia. We have kai. We really uphold those principles and uphold the mana of groups. And we also provide that sort of sense of being a sort of a kaitaki with groups coming in. It can be an intimidating space for some. And so we have a sort of a warm lead in and support groups to make sure that they feel supported and uphold their mana. And it's a space of not being this really formal meeting. It's about being ourselves, being our authentic selves, focusing on that relationship, understanding who they are, their whakapapa, where they've come from, and having an open, honest kōrero, as Seamus touched on. It's about, and Anna, about those relationships and being open and honest about where we're at and how we can support. So the outcome, yeah, we've had a number of groups that we've been engaging with, and I'll just tell you a little example just to give you a sense of the specifics of what it looks like. So we have a day that's set in the community, so we're moving to a space where they are. We're not making them come to us. And there was a new Māori group in our region, and they were actually identified as a newly registered charity on the Charity Services website. So we identified the setup. They hadn't started engaging with any funders. We had a kōrero with them, invited them in, and they came and met a number of funders in one place, and we talked about what their ideas were. So there were some items around the need for a waka. There was operational expenditure. So there was a number of us organisations and funders there. So the Rata Foundation were there. We had Te Pūtahitanga there. We had local governments. So we held Nelson City Council, Tasman District Council, and a range of different funders, and we could each identify where we could support. We also have a number of agencies such as us at Te Taritai Whenua and Rata Foundation. There's an increased opportunity to be responsive. So we have the ability in some cases to resource outside of those traditional funding rounds. And there's also a level of delegated authority to regional teams. So we have an ability for those, and in some cases, for those shared applications, so that they don't have to write 6 different applications. Some of the funders involved, we can collaboratively fund and support. And so it's really shifting into that space of being responsive to the needs, having that higher trust approach. And so, and some of the outcomes and responses are really positive from the group. So that's a little specific example there. Happy to answer any Hato questions around that. And then just lastly, some of the key reflections that I can certainly expand on. It's not rocket science, but it's doing those basics really well, you know, respecting those relationships. You need that backbone function of collaboration. You can't just expect it, you know, it to happen. You need people in those key roles, you know, whether it's just the minute taker, you need someone to hold that role of opening and closing, collaboration needs to be resourced. So there's an ability within our regional team and to resource that, coordinate it, organize it, communicate with groups. And so that backbone aspect is crucial. And just getting on and doing it. You know, you can plan as much as you want, things change, but getting in there and learning by doing is one of those key principles of community development. Sharing our strengths. Some people have strengths that really suit that strategic sort of level of support. Some people have that really detailed focus. So as a group of funders, we're actually, in a way, we've created this sort of community of learning. We're learning how we work, and the community also can see collectively how we work and where our strengths, assets, and resources are. And so, and also just locking in to our structures, this commitment to working together. You might have one or two people that work in this way, but if you don't sort of embed that in the terms of reference of your network or those structures, then those key people can move on, and then it all just starts back again. So it's really embedding those. So a couple of reflections, but there's a whole lot more, but I'm going to leave it at that. Kia ora, Christina. Kia ora, team.
Yeah, Mihi Blair, that is awesome. And I loved hearing you talk about how you identified that new group proactively. I think that's probably the best use of the charities register that I've ever heard of. And I've, you know, walked alongside the charities register since it was first developed. So yeah, that's awesome to hear of a really practical way that you've used that source of information to be proactive in your funding. So I'm sure that there are going to be some things that you will want to dig into deeper with our panelists, some partai that you have for them. So please pop them in the Q&A chat box now. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for those questions to come in, I just think it'd be really great to have some deeper reflection and conversation between all of our panelists. And one of the things that I have reflected on a lot in my time in funding is how we have the systems we have for a range of reasons, whether it's historical or risk aversion or, you know, constraints that we have been put in place around different types of funding pools, whether they come from government or wherever. And we've seen over time people, lots of different organisations, I think, making tweaks, you know, hearing some of that feedback and going, yes, it is hard for communities. So we as an organisation will make our form simpler, or we as an organisation will have a greater equity focus. But it's been quite challenging, I think, to move from making those little tweaks to actually some of those really transformative changes that would really get to the root and supercharge a complete change in how we fund and the effectiveness of that for our communities. And I'm really heartened to hear people talking about relationships and relationship focused funding, but also relationships between funders. Blair, you picked that up, and Seamus, you picked that. In fact, all of you have picked that up in your kōrero about relationships, because for me, relationships between funders are one of those transformational, supercharging kinds of things. If we can all work together collaboratively, the kind of collaboration that we say that we want our communities to be undertaking, if we can do that, I feel like that for me is one of those fundamental transformational changes that would help. So it's wonderful to hear of the different mahi that's going on within your organisations and within your regions about that. But I'm really interested to hear from you as a panel, you know, from your perspectives, what are some of those transformational changes that would really make a difference, or those fundamental changes? Anna, would you like to start off, you know, if you put some, I know you've put some thought into it, so I'd love to hear what you've got to say.
Oh, kia ora, Christina. Well, yeah, so I think that the way that we have been, well, the way that our community has sort of spoken to and revealed what is important to them. I just want to say also how heartened I am by listening to Seamus and Blair kōrero, because, you know, the sorts of change that they're leading, the space they're creating for collaboration, and also that appetite for risk at all those levels within their organisations is really exciting and heartening, and I hope to see more of that in Oti soon. So basically I think that what we have found is that there are people within the system that we have at the moment who are really up for relationships and are really there to be able to meet and connect with our communities, and they need to be supported to do that by their organisations, and also by us as community as well, and that those relationships they can be real levers for change. But I think ultimately we are talking about transformative change. We're talking about actually rebuilding this funding system, and I think that what needs to emerge is actually an Indigenous model, a Te Ao Māori model that actually looks at how we collectively work for the change that we need across our societies, and that if we're really talking about equity, we're going to have to rebuild the model. But right now I feel like one of the levers we have towards that transformative change is to really sit and occupy and nurture those relationships and the sorts of collaboration that Blair's been talking about. So yeah, just throwing that out there. We have to rebuild it basically. But,
Awesome. Seamus, Blair, do you have any other things to add to that, or to pick up on what Anna's saying, or other thoughts from your spaces?
I tautoko Anna 100%. You know, some of the lessons I've learned has been in a wānanga and a marae, when talking with someone and going, wow, you know, what if this doesn't work? You know, what are the risks? We have to go back, talk to trustees, talk those things. Well, they said, well, what about us? If it doesn't work for us, it's even way worse than it is for you, because we live in the community. You know, so it was another way of learning about risk, is not just for us. Like, you know, they're actually risking things by trying new ways of doing things through this approach. So that was kind of an interesting learning. And the second learning for me, again, in a cultural context, is, like Anna said, I think it's more of a collective partnership approach. It's us. How can it be us and the community group collectively taking on the big challenge that we're both trying to work on? We've got different attributes to add to the table, but it's us against the challenge, not them against the funding process. How do we kind of move to that? And nothing made it more clear to me when we went a collective funding hui ona marae, and the way that they positioned or framed it was, you are a manuhiri. You're a collective of funders, but you're a manuhiri. So sort out your koha, sort out your whakakōrero, sort out your waiata. You're not doing it 5 times, you're doing it once, because you're a partner coming on to partner with us, the hau kāinga. So that was an interesting way to think about it as well, is sometimes we can be a collective group, not just individual foundations.
I think it's really what, considering those key conditions, I think you hit on it, Christina, around one of those key conditions is the relationships. And with our collab sessions, that was the product of a lot of relationship building leading into that. So having that time and space to meet, get to know each other, understand each individual and organisation and how they work. And then once we got to that point of building those relationships and that trust with each other, then that created that opportunity for us to start taking those risks, actually start to commit together collectively to the idea of working in a way such as collab, where we set times and places, and also that some of the key tools, and Seamus touched on it, I think, there's certainly a lot of growth in the digital space, and I think nothing will replace that kanohi to kanohi, that face-to-face, but having that digital tool, you have the concept ideas such as match and te puna taurite, these ideas where we can actually complement these relational approaches and reduce that burden that community groups have through digital tools and co-location and other sort of key conditions and tools. I think that they're really going to enable that transformational change.
Awesome. Thanks team. I think just pulling out some stuff from there, I'm really interested in that change in thinking around we're all in a partnership together against or working towards something or against a challenge, funders and the people we're funding alike, and that also alters the power relationship a little bit, I think, when we realise that we rely on the doers as much as they rely on us. So that's a really interesting, I think, mental shift that helps, and then having those tools to enable the burden to be reduced as well. Thanks for mentioning that, Blair. We do have a question that has come through, and I'm not quite sure who's going to be the best person to answer this. So listen carefully, panelists, and decide if you want to jump in. Do you see greater recognition of social capital value from the business sector? And if so, I guess greater support for some of the community mahi coming from the private sector. Is that something that any of you have seen over your time in the funding sector or more recently?
Certainly, we're starting to see that. I mean, there are a number of organisations in our community that are really engaging with the business sector, and we've also had some recent discussions with the local Chamber of Commerce, local regional development agency. So there's a real intent and interest in how we can actually work better together with the business sector and how we can support these initiatives. So it's sort of early days, but yeah, we're certainly seeing movements in that space in our region.
Anna, I can see you nodding along there. Have you got anything you want to add to that?
Probably not completely specifically, but just that for me, it's part of the whole ecosystem of the sorts of communities and society that we're trying to build collectively. So everybody needs to be at the table. That would be my, yeah. Thanks. And I don't think we necessarily, from a community lens, where I very much operate from, we probably don't do that enough. Talk with our business leaders, with our you know, and actually think about everyone who needs to be at the table. So there's definitely more conversations that need to happen.
I agree. I think the business community are an important part of that ecosystem. But again, it's how do we get that common language, you know, a common way of working, and it often from community up, you know, and then supported by philanthropy, business, government, not kind of KPI led or, you know, coming in often with a real business strategic focus only.
That's a really good point, Seamus, that there's a whole lot of mindset shifts that you know, sit with the kind of relational funding that you're talking about, that may coming from different perspectives, different types of organizations, businesses, community, government funders, we're all coming from slightly different mindsets, and to make these things work really well, there needs to be at least an understanding of different mindsets, but ideally an alignment in support of the community. So really like that. And so another question here might be a difficult one to answer, but the person who asked the question was actually really impressed with your collab model, Blair, and they're wondering how they could adapt or develop this model here in Otago, which really speaks to how we can share and adapt the bright spots. While maybe Anna's answering that question, we've got a little poll up on the screen, which is just an opportunity for you to give some feedback for us on with how you're finding this. So please feel free to fill in that poll while we're getting the answer to that question. And maybe Blair, you can talk about that as well. How could your model be developed in other regions?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a number of colleagues across the country, and I don't want to throw them under the bus, but I mean, each region has one of us, and we are diverse teams, and we have a range of different programs that we work on, but there's certainly, it's within our kaupapa, you know, around collaboration and supporting. So there could be a local advisor that you can contact from Hāpai Hāpori within DIA and explore an opportunity to replicate and emulate something that's going to fit that region, because what works here is not necessarily going to work in another region. Just acknowledging that but certainly starting there is a good point.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Blair, as well. We often just love to go, oh, let's just scale something, you know. That's it's usually more complex than that. It's about grounding things in a local place and with the people in the community that are there, and learning from what's gone before there as well to build something new. Okay, do you have any comments, Anna, just to pull that?
Well, I think I'll just kia ora to you, Alan, and I think what I really love in Blair's kōrero is that was led by Hapai Hapori, like by DIA, but all of those elements that we know that are so important to community, the hospitality, you know, the awareness of the power relationship, you know, working on that collaborative, like bringing funders together so there weren't all these one-off, you know, sort of isolated, siloed conversations. All of that stuff just is very, very powerful. And I think probably what we've been trying to do here in Ōtepoti is, as community, we've been trying to host those conversations, but it's also incredibly powerful when it's, but you know, we're not actually resourced to do that. It is a volunteer effort. And so what we're really hoping to see is to see that resourcing and that true collaboration with community to be able to bring those conversations together. And yeah, so let's do it, Alan. Well, let's keep, yeah. And that's to acknowledge that we have been, you know, incredible DIA staff members here and who are spread so thin across so many kaupapa. So yeah, but I'm sure it's possible. So yeah.
Wonderful. That is a great note to end on, that it is possible, that the kinds of changes that we've been talking about are possible, can be achieved with the goodwill coming from, as Anna mentioned, and I just want to reflect back to that transformational change of thinking about this from a Te Ao Māori perspective and how that will change our funding if we really lean into that. So this has been a fantastic conversation, and we have put together more resources. There's a slide with some of those. We'll add some more in. The Anna's report, some of the material that Todd Foundation have put out there on the web. And also I just want to highlight Funding Fundamentals. So this is a professional development course that I developed last year with Philanthropy New Zealand. It's an online self-directed learning course this year, but there's some modules on there that are specifically focused on some of the things we've talked about. A couple of modules on relationships and equity and those sorts of things. So if that's of interest, go and check that out. There's also lots more happening with Inspiring Communities. So we have an Activating CLD Change workshop coming up in Selwyn, for those of you in Waitaha, Canterbury. We've got an online Child-Rich Communities kōrero talking about the richness and support that can be offered outside of traditional programs. And the amazing Denise Bijou is presenting 2 online workshops around evaluation for those in Waitaha, Canterbury in March and in Tamaki in May. And today also marks the start of Neighbours Aotearoa's month-long celebration of community connectedness with the theme, Let's Share. So we'll make sure that all of these events are hyperlinked when we send you the slides, so you can find out more if you want to be part of them. And for those of you who may not have heard about Paradigm, I mentioned that Anna and I are both associates. So we are the Inspiring Communities consulting arm, and our team, we're actively looking for projects to sink our teeth into for 2023. We can assist across a wide range of organisations there, and we've got, you know, some of the things that we can help with are up on that slide. So do get in touch if you feel like there's some support that we could offer you. And we will, as I say, be including those resources for you, but I'm going to finish now with karakia to close us out. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te aiao, te araha, me te marutau, tihei mauri ora. Thanks everyone. Go well. Mā te wā, and see you next time.